I think I'll just start just with a welcome to everybody to our evening with filmmaker and writer John Rogers, who we've had at the library the pleasure of collaborating with regarding his Kensal Rise Has a Story project, which is part of Brent Borough of Culture 2020 and part of the first ever, apparently, Brent Biennal of new art. So we'll see how that goes in the coming years. I'm Stephanie. I'm the library manager at Kensal Rise Community Library. And I'm delighted to welcome so many of you who I recognise who live in the area, who are my neighbours, and who've maybe been part of the library campaign. For those of you that don't know, the library was closed by the council in 2011. There's Henry coming. But after a massive battle by the community, we won back the ground floor and then spent a lot of time raising hundreds of thousands of pounds to refurb it. And now we're completely independent of the council, and we're run by volunteers. And we get no regular public funding. So here's a plea now, here's a bit of an advert. Sorry, John, to cut in on you, but the lockdown has cut off our income. So please, if you enjoy John and this free event, please play our lottery. It's part of the Brent Community Lottery. It only costs £1 a ticket and you could win £25,000. And 50p of each pound goes straight to the library. 10p is divided between other good causes in Brent, and the rest goes on the prize money. And I think we've got a slide about it at the end, but just Google Brent Lottery Kensal Rise Library page, and the details will come up. Thanks also to those of you who live locally who've contributed to John's project with your memories and your insights and your stories. And I'm also so delighted to welcome, it's so exciting, not just our lovely neighbours, but those of you that live further afield in London, the UK, and even globally. I know John's got many, many fans globally, so big welcome to you. And if you even maybe are in America, just to know that our library is the only one in the world that your great Mark Twain opened, which is extraordinary. Before I introduce John, and don't worry, I'm almost about to, just some housekeeping. As I admit, Rachel. Please, everyone, could you stay on mute? We are recording this, so if you feel not 100% comfortable with that, maybe switch off your camera now. I've already said earlier on that if you have a question, John's kindly going to be taking questions at the end of his presentation. Just type them in chat at the foot of your screen. And could you please precede them with a Q so that we know that it's not a comment, it is a question. And yes, that's it. So without further delay, let me introduce John. He is, as I say, a filmmaker. He's made loads of documentaries. We chose him as a library because even though we're independent of the council and as a community library, we still were involved, and we're very pleased about that in Brent 2020, and we're able to choose an artist, and we're delighted that we chose John. So without further ado, here he is, John.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on a Tuesday evening for this Zoom talk. Normally we'd be doing this in the beautiful environment of the library, wouldn't we? But this is not a bad substitute. So I'm actually going to start screen sharing a PowerPoint, and I will, as I said earlier on, I've got too many slides. I've taken thousands of photographs. I've gathered lots of archive material. So I may rattle through this at a fair old pace, and then we can pick things up in the Q&A, because, you know, I might joke about doing a 3-hour talk. No one really wants that, do they? So I'll just power up the presentation, which is always a slightly... So this map, this wonderful map designed by Joe Hales. He did a fantastic job of making sense of my kind of rather garbled Excel spreadsheet showing in where all the audio recordings were placed. These icons represent audio recordings I made with local residents, fragments of memories, some of it's information, bits of local history, just personal anecdote. And each of these locations, you can find a sign such as this one here with a QR code on it and a piece of text that is extracted from the interview. Here it's Inappropriate Books, which is from Roger, who was employee at Kensal Rise Library from 1965 to 1967. It was his first job, in fact, actually. And I'll show you a photograph of Roger later. That was the first walk that I did. It was a really special experience. Inappropriate Books, he's talking there about how the kind of quite ferocious custodian of the library at the time, I think a lady called Felicity, somebody Sparrow, Miss Sparrow, how she would restrict access to certain books. There was obviously Lady Chatterley's Lover, which goes without saying. I'm sure we all agree that no one should have to read that book. But amongst it also were books on Freemasonry and the occult, and these were in a restricted section that you had to ask access for, and she would make a judgment over whether you were allowed to read those books. She would make her own subjective judgments about who could and couldn't access what books. And when you scan that QR code with the photo app on your smartphone, it brings up this audio clip here. An audio clip like this. This is another one from Harvey in Herbert Gardens, talking about a bomb site that was marked with the letters WC. We're not sure what that refers to, but it seems to refer to a toilet, obviously, but it was also once a bomb. And there's 51 of these in total, and whittling it down to 51 was a terrible job. There's an expression in editing, a horrible expression, called "sometimes you have to kill your darlings." And this was like the slaughter of the innocents. There were so many darlings in this. There was so many gems, but in the end, I whittled it down to 51, which I think gave it a good kind of spread of an impression of the area. These two here. Really, the library is at the heart of this project. This project is generated by the library. The library is the beating heart of it. It wouldn't exist without the library. The library are integral in helping me find contributors to the project, but also actually as contributors to the project themselves. And this was a fantastic interview with Margaret, and I'll show you some of the outcomes of that later. But there was the campaign that Stephanie mentions to save Kensal Rise Library recently was very high profile. It was covered in the national media, and many people, when you say Kensal Rise, they remember that campaign. But there was a campaign before that has possibly maybe been forgotten, certainly by people outside the area. So it's really good to record that initial campaign when obviously campaigning techniques were very different to what they are now. I mean, there wasn't the internet, things were made by hand and people walked around with paper petitions, signing people up. And it was really great to be able to record those memories with Margaret. And there's another one here. This is another example. And you can see here the description of the psychogeographic sound trail. Obviously, sometimes that word intimidates and frightens people, but I would explain it. And it is really as simple as if you break it down, psychogeography is well, I won't preempt myself. Funny enough, reviewing it now, I realise how large the Second World War looms. I suppose as an event in our lives, it's still present both in our psyche, but also in the impact it made upon the built environment. So that did play into a lot of memories. This one's from Rose, actually, who's present, and it was this is one of the signs near Elmwood Tennis Club. And these two signs here, they're kind of represent in a way, if you like, the two ends of the spectrum of the type of recordings that you can find. On the left here, you have one from Ian, who lived in the area for probably about 15 to 20 years, and he lived in various housing associations and housing co-ops in the area. And this is referring to a pub, which is now quite a swanky restaurant in Regent Street. So I was a little bit dubious whether we'd get away with putting this up outside, but it used to be a rather grotty old boozer that would be full of people that had gone to funerals at Kensal Green Cemetery. And Ian he says, the best night he's ever had in a pub. Ian's a man who's had a few nights in pubs. I don't know if Ian's actually on the, I'm making that assumption, Ian, but he's Scottish. So, he's had a few good nights in the pub. The best night he ever had was about 1990 in that pub in Regent Street. And it's great. It's sticky carpets, the perfect London pub. And on the other side, you have kind of the type of local history that I kind of really enjoy finding. And it's an event that happened in 1906, an open air meeting of suffragettes. When that's the headline, actually, of a newspaper article that I'll show you later. And it was a very large meeting in favour of women's suffrage, organised by the Kensal Rise branch of the Women's Social and Political Union, Political and Social Union. Someone's corrected me on the internet saying that must be the wrong way round, but that is actually from the newspaper article. And that happened on the corner of Chevening Road and Chamberlain Road, and drew a very large crowd and was a big event at the time and drew many of the most prominent suffragettes of that time, but is not something necessarily that has passed down through history to us today. So actually, I can't really read my own. I can reduce the asset. Right. So just quickly, this is the initial kind of pitch, if you like. The project would aim to gather stories embedded in the streets local to Kensal Rise Library and produce a subjective and surprising audiovisual portrait of the area, investigating people's lived experiences, memories, and subjective psychogeography of the area. I've done a number of these sort of projects over the years, and I do a regular series of YouTube videos that are the latest manifestation of this work. And the first kind of fully funded project of this type I did, I think it was in 2004 in my hometown of High Wycombe. And really beneath it all is my belief that heritage is everywhere. We all own heritage. Heritage isn't externally defined by organisations which can tell you what heritage is. They can tell you what culture is. They can tell you what buildings are and aren't important. That is obviously the world that we live in. And psychogeography, if you like, I'll call it whatever you want, but there are methods in which we can leverage to transmit the things that we believe contain heritage value and cultural value within our landscape. And for example, I use the example that a bus stop can have as much cultural value as a ground listed building, because many of the ground listed buildings, you don't experience them at all. You might go there once on a school trip, but the bus stop might be part of your everyday life. It might be the place where many important events happen to you in your life. So, and those places contain stories the same as the kind of the canonical venues do as well. So that's part of my work is celebrating those places and celebrating, capturing and amplifying those stories, if you like. So just a quick note on psychogeography. I won't labour over this too long because it's not really that important, but it's a word that I use. It's a term that was first coined in 1955 by a group that were at the time called the Situationist International. In fact, actually, I think at the time they were called the Letterist International. They're a group of French intellectuals, and it's literally the study of the specific effects of the geographical environment, whether consciously organised or not, on the emotions and the behaviour of individuals. My favourite working definition of the psychogeographic practice of walking, which is called dérive. So that is a way of which you can map your environment. And you can kind of uncover these emotional reactions, and you can study the way that the environment is affecting the behaviour of individuals. Is this method of walking and consciously walking and making notes and documenting it. The great rock critic Grail Marcus, author of a fantastic book called Lipstick Traces, he described the psychogeographic dérive to enable you to encounter the unknown facets of the known, astonishment on the terrain of boredom, and innocence in the face of experience. And I like that as a kind of working definition. So my process at the beginning, back in January, was twofold, really. One, to get stuck into the archives and archival material and to see what I could find there. And also to do walks with the residents. In reality, a lot of the walks ended up being sit down, actually, and just where I would record interviews with people. So it became less important to walk with everybody. But I did a number of walks with residents. And these two things overlap. So the archival material would inform some of the walking and some of the interviews. We would use some of that material as to kind of prompt responses or as provocations. And likewise, when you walk, you uncover many things and you discover things, and then you go back to the archive to see what you can find about what you've encountered in the streets, and it's a continuous process. The first question I really asked was, where is Kensal Rise? In order to determine the boundary of the project, or indeed whether the project needed to have a boundary. Roger, who I walked with, who was the first person, he was quite clear on that, actually, that he thought the users of the library lived within a very specific boundary that actually went beyond what people would consider the current Kensal Rise, but didn't include much of what people would consider Kensal Rise. But he was adamant that much of the northern part of Kensal Rise, where the shops are, and where the pub is wasn't Kensal Rise, but they weren't library users when he worked there. Whereas the area around Kensal Green was solidly within the domain of the library. It's an intriguing question. And when I first went to my maps, I remember this was the first map I looked at, and this is a Land Ranger Ordnance Survey map of London, of northwest London. And you can see here what's intriguing is, for those of you that know the area, the first thing you'll notice is that Kensal Rise is written solidly over Queen's Park. That open space there is Queen's Park. Queen's Park today is a very desirable bit of real estate. Houses there are incredibly expensive. There's a lot of like celebrities live around there. This map, I think, dates from the 1970s, when Queen's Park would not have been such a desirable place. Either way, Kensal Rise there is significantly to the east of what people would consider Kensal Rise today. But this is the Ordnance Survey map. This is the official map. This is a 1955 Geographic Atlas, and this is the one that really excited me. When I looked at it, I went, wow, for a psychogeographer, if you like, my zone, my territory is a perfect triangle almost. You can see there, Chamberlain Road, the road's marked in yellow, Chamberlain Road, Liddell Gardens there across the middle, the Harrow Road at the bottom, Kensal Rise written right in the middle of there. And that's a really, even just as a illustration, that's a beautiful illustration. If you were just to walk all the streets within that triangle, that'd be a beautiful project. So that was something, by the way, that I could use as a start point when I would talk to people. And this is apologies for the resolution of this image, but this is a map. I think this is 1920. I've got some more later on. But what's interesting here, what intrigued me, was two things really. A, the presence of the allotment gardens, a larger area of allotment gardens in the northern quarter of today's Kensal Rise, and also the presence of the athletic ground, a large stadium which is actually used for multiple things, but it was once home to Queen's Park Rangers. I think it was also used for Zeppelin, early balloon rides and Zeppelin flights as well. So I tweeted out, I leveraged the power of social media. What do you do when you want to know something? Of course, you go to Twitter. And so I tweeted out, I'm trying to define the boundary of Kensal Rise. The OS maps seem to place it slightly east of the triangle in Queen's Park. The map is not the territory, as the great psychogeographer Ian Sinclair would say. Ian Sinclair is probably the great living London writer. He's written so many books about London. He's the kind of go-to place. He popularized the term psychogeography as well. And this was a great reply. And actually someone said, sometimes you have to go back to the development of the estates. It's quite often defined, it's often a quite defined area, but even then that doesn't mean that people who live there now see those actual boundaries as blurring between the two areas. And that was one of the constant things, is I asked everybody actually that I either sat down and interviewed or I walked with, where is Kensal Rise? And I can tell you now, nobody agreed. Everybody gave me a different answer, which I think is fascinating. There are reasons for that actually. And one of the reasons is, I will be quite controversial about it, is Kensal Rise doesn't really exist as a geographical term. It's really a developer's term for an area, and that's why it's moved around quite a lot. It went where people wanted it to go, and it took its name from the station, which I think was called Kensal Rise in 1890. So it was originally Kensal Green, and then it became Kensal Rise. So I went to the Brent Archives, the wonderful Brent Archives at Willesden Library, and these borough guides are fantastic resources if you're looking into the history of an area. There's an awful lot of them that were published in the 1920s and 1930s, when many, if not most, of the London boroughs were celebrating their 50th anniversary. Most London boroughs came into existence around the 1870s and 1880s. So local government actually as a concept is, quite a recent thing. It's when most of London was built around the railways. Many London suburbs are railway suburbs. Willesden, obviously, key amongst them. And this, just as a piece of artwork, it's a really beautiful object, doesn't it? It tells you a lot about the way that I find, I read these things obsessively and collect them where I find them. And they were so proud of their achievements in building hospitals and schools, of building electricity substations and water pumping stations. They thought it was the greatest achievement in humanity. And just the artwork as well. It's a really beautiful piece of artwork. And these borough guides from this era tend to be quite quirky as well. And because it was still, local government was still a relatively amateur pursuit. Kensal Rise then was in the Borough of Willesden. Obviously, Willesden gets merged in to become Borough of Brent in the 1963 Local Government Act, comes actually into being in 1965. And this is an image that I found in the archives. I also actually bought this on eBay, and it shows it's a footpath leading to Kensal Rise. And you can see how rural Kensal Rise was when this photograph was taken, which I think is about 1900. It could be slightly after 1900, as we'll see in a moment. And this is, I believe, it doesn't say on the postcard, but I think from looking at the maps, this is the bottom end of the main street in Kensal Rise, Chamberlain Road, which you can see on the old maps becomes a footpath and would lead to Kensal Rise. And you can see there that Kensal Rise station would have sat amongst fields. And this is roughly, this is not exactly where it is, but it's more or less where that photograph would have been taken. This is it today. This is Chamberlain Road today. There it is there. It may be slightly further up that street, but it's more or less, it gives you an idea of the transition which has taken place. So in the archives, I looked at the Ordnance Survey maps. This was the oldest one that they had. It's 1864. And you can see this is you can sort of see the shape of the triangle there, can't you? And you can see how, like the comment I received on Twitter, the shape of the development roughly follows the field boundaries. But in 1864, it was all fields. There's a little bit of development at the bottom of that image, you can see, around Kensal Green, but you've got, apart from the railway lines, it's all fields. There's a little bit of development as well at the top. And then one of the things that I tend to look for is the traces that come down to us through time. Springs, however deep you bury a spring, they have a habit of coming back to you. They often, you'll find them flooding basements. They will sometimes blow out street irons after heavy rain. You can't get rid of the springs. They will always be there. They're ever present. The water will flow. And I also like to follow submerged rivers as well. And in fact, I walked the River Fleet at the weekend, the most obvious and famous of London's lost rivers, but I'd never walked all of it before. And I did that the weekend, and it's a magnificent walk. And rivers and springs, they still define the shape of the land. So you can see some springs here, and you can see one of the buildings, actually, the few buildings on that map, Mount Pleasant. Mount Pleasant, by the way, you can see Chambers Lane, by the way, that is the footpath in that postcard. Mount Pleasant was often used ironically. There's a few Mount Pleasants, like the one actually near the River Fleet in Islington. That was used ironically because it was a dump. It was a place where they would dump all the refuse from the street. And so they ironically called it Mount Pleasant. I think this one is because it is very high up and it's lovely. And this is the 1871 map. And you can see actually not much. There's been a little bit of development around the southern end there. And you can see the triangle is marked out with blue lines. I don't know when those lines were put in. In fact, I don't really know what they indicate, but you can now see Kensal Rise, can't you? The shape of Kensal Rise there. And again, we've got some more detail. This is going forward to around 1920, and you can see now how much it is built up over that time. And this was the map from 1920 from that Willesden Borough Guide that I used as a kind of provocation when interviewing people to get them to look at it and to get their subjective response to this map. And these are the news articles that I found, some of the news articles I found in the archives. On the left there is the report of the open air meeting of the women in the franchise. And it's quite a funny article, actually, the way it describes young men heckling, but it's largely supportive and complimentary. It's from the Willesden Chronicle, which I believe is still going, right? And a meeting there when Clement Attlee visited Kensal Rise in 1951. And there's a report in that brochure of Mark Twain, as Stephanie mentioned, of the opening of Kensal Rise Library by Mark Twain in 1900. And some photos of the development there. This is something I found in one of the reports. In 1911, the population of Kensal Rise was described as ranging from the very poor who, when thrown out of work, have little or nothing to fall back on, to those who have regular employment as clerks, accountants, salesmen, etc. in the city. And this is from Wikipedia. In 2009, Chamberlain Road in Kensal Rise was named by Vogue as the hippest street in Europe. I think this was something that was, we were all collectively, both the library and myself were collectively keen to impress, is that, there's Kensal Rise is known as this kind of hub of gentrification, if you like, a very shishy area, which kind of overlooks the fact that many people have lived there for a long time. In fact, Stephanie's lived there, I know, for a long time. One gentleman I interviewed, Harvey, moved there in 1950 with his parents. He still lives there. Barbara, who I interviewed, has lived there since the early 1930s. So this image of the people buying up these very expensive houses is only one small element of the story. And of course, that story is amplified by people who have a financial incentive in amplifying that story, i.e. estate agents. But that's not really the story of the area at all. It smooths out the edges and doesn't really tell the story of the people, all the multiple stories anyway, and all the narratives that exist in the streets. These are some images, some of my first walks around the area. There we got Mount Pleasant. There's the highest point in the old parish of Willesden. And these are some from Instagram stories. And you can see there the allotments there in an area that would have been allotment gardens going back to the 1920s. And a reminder of Brent's position of the London Borough of Culture, which is a nice touch. And the connection to All Souls College, Oxford, is littered around the streets. There are very obvious ones, such as here, All Souls Avenue, but there are less obvious ones as well. Many of the streets are named after the fellows of All Souls Avenue. And in fact, All Souls College, Oxford, who gained possession of this land, I think in the 15th century, I could be wrong, but certainly since the Middle Ages, they still own they still own land in the area. It was All Souls who started developing the land in the late 19th century, and they still own both a few bits of open space, but they also own houses in the area. Some people still pay rent to All Souls College, Oxford. So here's the first walk that I did, and it was with Roger from the Willesden Local History Society. Here is Roger with Stephanie at the library, and it was the first time Roger had been back to the library since he'd left in 1967. And I think it was quite an emotional occasion for both Roger and Stephanie, I think, because I think Roger had no idea what had happened to the library. And I think it was quite a big time for him. I mean, that's where he started his working life. So I'm just looking at the chat there. How do I hide the chat? Sorry, I've slightly confused myself with putting the chat in the window. I can close it kind of. So that was a really good walk with Roger around the streets. I'll show you some of his contributions later on. And this is with Harry and Margaret from the Willesden Local History Society. They are the kind of local history experts, if you like, and we would have done a talk with them in the library if COVID hadn't reared its head and forced events like this to be cancelled. But here we are stood on what they identified as the Brondesbury Ridge. And we often don't understand the shape of the land, the topography of London, because it's not something that we tend to highlight. But the Brondesbury Ridge is a clearly identifiable geological and geographical feature of the area, a high ridge of land that runs across northwest London. And here we are stood upon the Brondesbury Ridge. And this is another thing that Harry and Margaret pointed out, that the way that there were Willesden board schools. Obviously not all the schools were Willesden board schools, but these were some of the schools that would have been built by the Willesden Board of Education that they were very proud of. And here's the friezes that you find on numerous houses around the area. This is particular, I think this is Clifford Gardens. And they're a particular feature. You find this around London, and they tend to be builders' marks, and they often identify who the builder would have been. But I think in this case, it's celebrating the agricultural past of the area. And you can see there's a person there with a scythe, a hand scythe, gathering crops. So they were harking back to when these houses would have been built, to the recent agricultural past of the area. And there we are, studying some OS maps in the library. This was a great interview with Richard and Irina. Richard there on the right, these are also, Richard and Irina are both from the Willesden Local History Society. And Richard's a real aficionado of Queen's Park Rangers, and so he told me a lot about the early history of Queen's Park Rangers, when they had several grounds around the area. They were formed by a church in the area, I think, St Jude's Church. It was like a social event, a social club that they started, and that became Queen's Park Rangers. And I think they were originally called St Jude's, in fact. And they played in various grounds around Kensal Rise. Some of them are not entirely known. One of them was near the current Kensal Rise station, the athletic ground, which you can see on the maps. They played in about 4 or 5 grounds around the area before they finally went a little bit further west. And Irina told me some wonderful stories about the cemetery and also the old plough, which is interesting and caused some discussion. This is a contribution from Rose, and we did a lovely walk together. And this is, I thought this was probably one of the most poignant things that I captured, this floral tribute to Henry. And we often see these tributes when we walk around London, don't we? We assume that maybe someone's recently passed. Often we don't know much about them. But this was a lovely, Henry was a much loved coach at the Onward Tennis Club who had passed away some years before. And this floral tribute is kept there fresh by the members of the club in memory of Henry. So it was really great to be able to capture that and put a plaque near this point so people could make that association and remember Henry. And here is Rose doing a bit of urban archaeology in the green space around Elmwood Tennis Club. But this is interesting. This is a little patch of land which I believe is still owned by All Souls College that people might not necessarily know was there. It's like a now little unofficial nature reserve. And this is Barbara Burr, one of her photographs of her at school. I think it's the school that we saw earlier on, the Willesden Board School in the 1930s, before the Second World War. And this was, again, a really poignant moment. This was the identity bracelet that all children used to wear during the war in case they got blown up on their way to school. And if they were, well, sometimes this is all that would be recovered in the rubble, which is quite a shocking thing to hear from someone's mouth as they show you the identity bracelet they wore as a child. This was something that Dilys pointed out, walking down Chamberlain Road, the kind of thing that you would pass by and not really take much notice of. A classic thing when walking around the urban environment is always look up, obviously not when crossing the road. But this is a chemist called Dolmedes, but above it you can see these engraved, these initials DG, and it was a shop that was there before in the past called David Gregg's that was, like Dilys described, as one of the very early forerunners of the supermarket shop. You could buy everything, go in there, and it was all laid out, and you could go around the various departments, pick up what you needed. And this is Margaret from the library, who told me all about the history of the library and the campaigns to save the library. And it was really great to record those memories. And this is some of the wonderful photographs that Margaret showed me from the original library campaign, I think in 1988. And I think things like this are so often lost and so often forgotten, and they are such a precious part of our social history. They really deserve to be archived in the grandest museums alongside, the more famous events. These are such an important part of our collective story, I think. And within Margaret's folder was this account of the time Mark Twain spent in Dollis Hill and how he ended up opening the library. And that's a walk, actually, I'm going to put together from Dollis Hill House down to Kensal Rise Library, imagining that Mark Twain would have walked there on the day that he opened the library. And this is Sally, who interviewed at the Kensal Green Under Fives, which is a wonderful community nursery. It's the last community nursery in Brent. And this is what Margaret and Pam and Sally told me about the history of the community libraries, how the GLC, the Greater London Council, had set up a number of them over the years. And as the years have gone on, funding's been withdrawn and they're gradually closed. This is the last one still going in the London Borough of Brent. And Sally is a new parent, but also a parent governor at the Under Fives, and very involved in the running of the nursery, which is a really wonderful place. And it was really great to Sally grown up elsewhere in Brent. So as well as these kind of deeper histories of the area and people that are talking about the 1930s and the memories of the 1930s, it was great to get the impressions of someone that's recently moved to the area from another part of the borough, and they can contrast the different ambiences and the different atmospheres when you move relatively short distances, but actually you're in a very different zone altogether. And two of the wonderful people I recorded on the left there, Viveth, who I think is the station manager at Kensal Rise. I'm sure local people here are well aware of Viveth. And as I left the station that morning, she was singing. She said, "Can I record your singing?" Expecting her to say, "You must be joking." But she obviously came out from the station and performed for me and sang "I've Been to Paradise, Would You Believe?" It's a famous poem about paradise by way of Kensal Green, which I think is by G.K. Chesterton, isn't it? And then she told me about the area and gave me the title to the project, actually. And she said, "Kensal Rise has a story, and I'm glad I'm a part of it," which is a really wonderful sentiment. And on the right here, we have Jim in his allotment at Leighton Gardens, but Jim is also the founder, I believe, of the College Green Preservation Society, which I think was founded in 1970 to preserve College Green and to stop All Souls College from building on it. And this is one of the artifacts that Jim had dug up on his allotment. And when I went to speak to Jim and Josephine at their allotment that day, I just expected them to tell me about gardening, really, and allotments. But Jim went straight into the archaeology of the area, the deeper history of it, the idea that in the Neolithic, well, actually before that, but around the time of the first or second ice age, this would have been a rare part of dry land when the waters of the Thames were much, much wider. And he believed that this was an artifact from the deep past that he'd excavated in his library. Excavated in his allotments, all the same. And so this is how Viveth's story ends up on a sign, on a plaque near the station. And this is Sean. I think Sean in the chat said he had to leave the meeting. But this is Sean who came up to Kensal Rise to go around the trail on the day that it launched. And here's Sean. I think it was the week after, actually. But here's Sean at the map, Joe Halesey's map that we have outside the library. And then there's Sean listening to one of the recordings there, which was great. When I did this, and I did so many recordings, 51 of them, I never imagined that someone would get a map and walk around the whole lot. But I personally know several people who did just that. It's quite a long way if you do it that way. It takes a good few hours. And Sean was one of them, and he marked. In fact, he did it twice. He did it once on his own, and then he came around with me, which was incredible, really. I'm incredibly grateful for that, and marked each one off as he went, which is wonderful. I'm nearly done now, actually, really ready for questions. And so here's how some of those interviews manifested themselves as signs on the streets. The All Souls connection, Margaret talking about the connection between All Souls College and the area. The wonderful story of Claude Bathurst, or Bathurst, however you want to say it. Bathurst Gardens, you may not think was necessarily linked to a fellow of All Souls College, because also Bathurst is a place in New South Wales as well, isn't it? But Claude Bathurst was one of the fellows of All Souls, and this is an anecdote that Margaret picked up on a visit to All Souls, actually. The Bromsbury Ridge, as I mentioned earlier. This is interesting. Lady Smith, this is in Wrentham Avenue. Those of you that know the area, this is Wrentham Avenue, one of the big streets in the area. It was originally called Ladysmith Avenue, and the name was changed after there had been a gruesome murder where I think the body was found in a trunk afterwards, and so they changed the name to lose that bit of its history. But of course, there are people like Harry and Margaret who make it their duty to go and uncover these stories, and here we've revived it. And also as well, like, it's another resonance because it's a lot of the streets, a lot of London was built around the time of the Boer War, and so consequently a lot of places were named after places where battles had taken place, or just commemorations of places in southern Africa. Where I'm sat right now, I'm sat right near Pretoria Road in Leytonstone and Rhodesia Road, so these are all around us, and when they change the names, those links are lost. Well, they're not lost, actually. I mean, you can recover anything, but and also that there was a school in Wrentham Avenue where Belgian refugees were hosted during the First World War. This is the kind of thing I love. This is at the top of the triangle, and this is Harry claiming that there is a source of the Counters Creek there at the point of the triangle on the highest land on the Bromsbury Ridge. Now, I'm sure, as many of you will know, as great students of the Lost Rivers of London, the Counters Creek is said to rise further down that hill, further south in Kensal Green Cemetery. So that's quite a contentious point amongst London topographers. I can imagine great arguments being started by this assertion that the source of the Counters Creek is high up on the Bromsbury Ridge, but it's entirely possible In fact, there is a spring there which feeds the spring down in Kensal Green Cemetery and leads to the flowing waters of the Countess Creek, which is completely submerged, by the way. Now it's all underground. This is a wonderful story that Stephanie shared, a really poignant story about her mother coming to England on the Kinder transport. And again, these are the kind of stories that get so easily forgotten. And it's such a really profound moment in our history, in our collective history, that children, were sent away from their families for their own safety to come and live in the United Kingdom. So it's always good to revive and remember these things, because they, like I say, they do get forgotten if we don't keep repeating them. This is from Jim at the College Green Preservation Society. Reminding people that at that point you're 236 feet above sea level, which is quite high up. Willesden and Brent have a number of high points, by the way. Oxenden Hill is another one, which is, I think, slightly higher. And again, a lovely kind of subjective memory from Stephanie, just remembering the experience as a young child, walking the streets of Kensal Rise, to get books from the library, to buy some sweets and to go home and sit on her bed and read library books and eat sweets. And that joy of both being part of the local community, but also the joy of reading, and how that becomes a lifelong love. And now here's Stephanie saving Kensal Rise Library and running it. From Barbara, who, sometimes we say from up here, this was all fields. Well, Barbara really does remember that. And when her family moved into Liddell Gardens, I think it was Liddell Gardens, everything to the north of there was fields. And it's rare to find someone in London with such memories. This was lovely from James. I've noticed, actually, looking at there's something smeared there. I don't want to think too much about what that might be. But that idea that the moving nature of what was Kensal Rise and Kensal Green, and how over his lifetime he's seen that change. The areas that people refer to as Kensal Green, Kensal Rise has grown immeasurably, whilst Kensal Green has shrunk. But when he was a kid, it was the other way around. Kensal Green was it was better to sort of say you were from Kensal Green. And so I put this in an area which is in that debatable zone, which could either be Kensal Rise or Kensal Green. Quite just a reminder here from Roger that many of the streets are named after fellows of All Souls College. Sally talking about how the area differs from Harlesden. This is the sentiment from Sally, Margaret and Pam about the ethos of the Kensal Green under fives nursery, that everybody's values, everybody has a place. Ian just remembering that he got a housing association flat. One of the things I was keen to celebrate and to acknowledge in the area is that many of these houses are, well, I don't know if they're many, but a number of the houses in the area, although people talk about the real estate value of them, many of them are housing association, or in fact local authority owned. So there's still a significant portion of social housing tenants in the area. And Ian remembering how he got a housing association flat in Mortimer Road in 1991. And this was actually, I really loved the fact that this became a contentious issue, that this is where Irina says this is the original old plough. Now, in the local history of the area, there is a celebrated pub called the Old Plough which is recognised as being in a different location, but there was a previous Old Plough here. And this is Paradise by way of Kensal Green today, but it is the original Old Plough, funnily enough, although it changed its name in the distant past a number of times. And so its link to the Old Plough got lost. So that's the kind of thing I like to revive, and that's the cemetery. You can find all those audio recordings, you can find them on the project blog there. There's a playlist and you can listen to each of them there. And there's some thanks I'll leave there. And we can answer some questions. And actually, sorry, what we should do, I'll just leave that for a little bit longer whilst we start to get other questions. And we've got the Brent lottery information there. You can add that there, and I will try and get the chat up. Look at this, I've got all these. I think I may have to stop screen sharing, Stephanie, in order to get the questions up.
No worries.
Stop sharing. So should I just let's have a look at some questions.
Comments, actually.
Good Lord. That wasn't too bad, was it, time-wise? It was all right. It's about slightly longer than planned, but
Brilliant.
So,
Thank you.
Billy Bragg, got that. We'll be able to watch later. I think so, Sean. I think we will. Can't see the map. Marco, hi Marco. We're watching a bit. Sorry, lots of comments on the Kensal. Where's the first question? Alan Goodall, Kensal Rise and Kensal Green. The reason for the muddling of these, which is unavoidable, really, is that the local stations have moved and changed name over time. That's quite right, isn't it, Alan? Kensal, what is today Kensal Rise Station, was originally Kensal Green Station, and it was in a different location. Kensal Green Station is newer, isn't it? It's I think it was there 1911. There was, I think, the other one was built in, I think, 1870 something, and then its name was changed, I think, in the 1880s or 1890s. Rose, how did you decide that footpath was at that point in Chamberlain Road? That's because the editor of Vogue lived nearby. What I wish now, actually, Rose, that I had found was the map that shows the point at which Chamberlain Road becomes a footpath. And that's why I think it may have been slightly further north, although the text saying leading to Kensal Rise would be a little bit misleading. But in one of the maps that I've got, you see the point at which Chamberlain Road stops and becomes a footpath across open fields. And it was roughly around that point, slightly further north. But that's how I decided that. I couldn't find it for the presentation, unfortunately. The editor, that's because the editor of Vogue lived. Oh, there you go. She's the ex-editor of Kensal Rise pays rent to All Souls. That's interesting. I'm sure Stephanie would be able to confirm that. Peppercorn rent. Only symbolic. Okay, it's a discussion about how much rent the library pay. But it's interesting, isn't it, that when I read about the role of All Souls College in the closure of the libraries, because they also tried to close Cricklewood Library as well, right? Or sold it to a property developer. And I thought the irony of this great bastion of learning, removing access to books to people in northwest London in areas which are still quite socioeconomically, deprived, was, well, not ironic, scandalous. The Oxford colleges possess great wealth, and obviously in the case of All Souls, it was linked to the church. They were given the land via their connection to St Paul's Cathedral, and somebody, I think one of the vergers or one of the people connected with St Paul's starts All Souls College, and so the land, a portion of land was bequeathed to them, and then over the years various former fellows have donated land to them. So they own all of Oxford, the colleges. Oxford, I think, real estate in Oxford, I think, however you measure, is more expensive than it is in London for that very reason, which is interesting. I think the ownership of land is a quite an interesting question. We don't really often know who owns the land, and when you look into it, I think some of the Canadian Teachers Pension Fund own an awful lot of central London, which is odd. A lot of those empty office blocks in central London are owned by the Canadian Teachers Pension Fund, which is interesting. I went to school with Greg daughters, but not locally, before self-service cheese wrapped for you. Excellent. Next door to David Greggs was Home and Colonial. Yes. What was great, Fred, was Dee actually named all the shops along there and said what all of them. And there's a wonderful story about how the florist married the child of the Tyndall sweet shop, and the two great retail families were joined through marriage. So those recordings are out there in the street. Question: on an early map you showed, I spotted what is now the Macam on Wrentham Avenue. Do you know what it was way back? What is the Macam? Steffi, do you know what that is?
Yes, it was a building that then Cat Stevens, who's now Yusuf Islam, took over, and it's the Macam Centre now. It's been redeveloped again. Right. It was previously a synagogue, and somebody kindly before that has said in the early 20th century it was another 1916. Well, further down anyway, it's a different flavour of...
Is that the place that hosted the Belgian refugee children then?
I don't...
That had been a...
Tiverton Green.
I think that might have been a church, I think, or something that hosted the Belgian refugee... Or a Methodist chapel or something.
The Methodist church is on Chamberlain, on the corner of Chamberlain and Wrentham, except right on the corner is the Catholic church, and then beyond that is the Methodist church. But the Macam is opposite Tiverton Green. It's up that. It's Tiverton.
Okay, yeah. I think, yeah, I know the building you mean there actually, because it's that's a question for Harry and Margaret, the wonderful Willesden Local History Society, who I was familiar with before I came to work in the area. Actually, when I was writing my book, This Other London, look at that as a seamless plug for the book. I had bought their.
The Macam used to be a Congregationalist church. A photograph from 1919 was posted on our street WhatsApp just a couple of days ago. And my neighbour who was here from the 1930s referred to it as actually a United Reformed church in his time. So it was a church until relatively recently.
So that may have been where the Belgian refugee children were hosted then.
It was great.
Yeah, there's this photograph which Salisbury World has, well, anyway, it was liked by them. There are lots of children, whether they are the Belgian children, I don't know.
Oh. Fascinating. Thank you for that.
It was pretty derelict when we came here in 1993. There was a youth centre on the ground floor, which was always getting into trouble, and a nursery for a while. And we're still waiting for the building works to be finished, and then it will be a beautiful space upstairs and a performance space.
Wow. Does Cat Stevens still perform?
No.
No.
He does. He started again, but he's used to Islam.
Yeah.
But it's a leisure centre on the ground floor now with a swimming pool.
Oh wow, looks amazing. It's interesting that it was a synagogue before that and a church before that, which is something you find a lot in London. I know famously there's that building in Brick Lane, isn't there, which has gone through a similar transition over the years. That was a Huguenot chapel and then a synagogue and now a mosque. And what was interesting was interviewing Harvey, who told me that there had been 5 synagogues in the area, and I would say actually 6, because he didn't mention that one, Stephanie, funnily enough. But so there were at least 5 in there, and it was a very important Jewish area at one point in the past. Actually, somebody who I know, the wonderful filmmaker Adam Kossoff, grew up in the area, and he went to school. He went to Hebrew school, a synagogue there, which is now a block of flats. And I think there's only one synagogue in the area now at Bronsbury, the Bronsbury Synagogue, which is quite a large synagogue. So these things, again, these are things that if they're not recorded, they get forgotten. You know, that demographics change, communities move on. It's important to record their presence. The library currently, Kensal Green Ward, over 1,000. Wow, that's amazing in the ward. That's great. It's amazing. See, people wouldn't know that, would they? They wouldn't necessarily make that association. Pig trading spot earlier than that in the Paris. Wow, that's interesting. Thank you, John, as always. It's all treasure trove. Oh, I shouldn't read out compliments. Thanks, Marco. Marco is an incredibly knowledgeable man himself, actually, so that's high praise. Please display the link on the website so I can capture it. I will bring that up again. Jay, we could possibly email it to you, or if you follow the library, the library could tweet it out to the sound. You can just go directly to the SoundCloud playlist. Hetty, that was really interesting. Enjoyed it very much. I need to go now, John. Thanks for joining us. Oh, you've probably gone. Alan Goodell, that's a name I feel I recognise. Alan, he may have emailed me in the past.
He made a comment earlier on that you read out about the stations changing.
1916, I think, for Kensal Green Station before it's okay. Start the footpath. It's past the Lexi Cinema where the buildings are newer. Oh, okay. Thank you for that, Stephanie. Oh, this is great. Tony Burr, this is great. Announcement. Sundays at 2 p.m. I'll be at the library to lead off anyone, 1s and 2s, to walk, listen, report any missing, damaged plaques. See you there. Brilliant. Thank you for that, Tony. That's a wonderful thing. And I like the way you're doing it in small groups. I did think about walking around with a Bluetooth speaker to play them out loud.
Mitchell Lane has agreed to look out for any missing or damaged plaques, and so I'm organising it on behalf of Mutual Aid. So 2 p.m. on Sundays, please join me. Any other time, of course, if you want to. Cheers.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tony. That's fantastic. Need to check whether the All Souls still owns Elmwood Tennis Club. I'm not sure it does. See, yes, Rose. That's a good point. Thanks so much. Very interesting. The library campaign had a bit of a mixed relationship with All Souls College. They weren't uniformly hostile all the time. Margaret B played an important part in winning them round, at least partially. Harrow and Eton make a lot of rents from the area. That's interesting. Is it true that terms set up by All Souls prevent the sale of alcohol or long-term pubs and off licenses? This was an interesting thing that Roger raised, actually, that there was a covenant on the land that said that they wouldn't be able to sell alcohol. That may be a religious thing, but we know the church, if they don't really, they encourage consumption of alcohol. I mean, they used to brew all the beer once upon a time. All the breweries were next to, that's how they used to make their money once upon a time. I would say that's more likely because when a lot of the area was developed, it was perceived that there was a problem with public drunkenness in London. It was actually something that probably Mark Twain would have written about. A lot of visitors to London commented on it, that there was a big problem. So when they were developing new suburbs, it was quite common to develop them as temperance suburbs, as a selling point to the respectable middle classes they were hoping to attract, that it was a temperance suburb. There's a lot of them around East London, funnily enough, as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was the reason. There's a really wonderful area near me, further actually in Redbridge, called Aldersbrook, which is beautiful. It still doesn't have a pub, and it was because it was built as a temperance suburb and there was a covenant on it. But there is a pub to the island. Roger seemed to think that that was something that had been done. He had a wonderful story that the estate manager at the time had done a backdoor deal to allow a pub to open without the knowledge of All Souls, which I quite like that idea that that's how the pub opened up. Kensal Green cuts through 4 different boroughs: Brent, Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea, and Hammersmith and Fulham. That's unique in London. Great fact, Dean. Lovely. How did you get the extracts so short? I'm worried they'd drag a bit, but they fit well into. It was mostly quite easy, Alan. In a lot of them were quite easy because they were either in chunks or they were easy to edit into chunks. I didn't have to. There's an wonderful expression in editing called Frankensteining. When you're taking words from all over the place. I didn't really have to do that at all. Really, everyone spoke very well. I mean, I'm umming and ahhing a lot of the moment. There was a lot of cutting out of ums and ahs, but it was interesting to try and work out what the optimum length. So I thought between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. Some of them are longer, just because they deserve to be longer, and I thought people could listen to them online as well. The map I saw the Macam is very short. Is there a time limit on the project being available? No. Is there scope to increase it? It's a good question, actually. The Borough of Culture, so the Brent Biennal has a fixed time frame, which I believe it might be extended a little bit due to the second lockdown and all the libraries having to close. But there's no reason for this work to be taken down. In terms of expanding it, I suppose it's down to the resources to put the plaques around, but we could certainly add to it. I mean, it was part of my original intention to kind of do workshops so that the audio archive could be added to, that we could, I don't know quite how that would be done. I mean, people could make recordings and then they just add them to a playlist, I guess. So there's no reason why it can't be carried on in some form. I welcome thoughts on a form that's easy for other people to, maintain. Actually, although in a different part of Brent, where you're aware the Grange Museum, which was in Neaston before it closed. I don't think I do know that, Rosetta. Actually. I feel like I may have come across it when I was researching my book, but no, I never visited it, so I don't really know it. More cats. Leon Kossoff, yes, that's right. So Leon Kossoff lived in the area, the Kossoffs, the famous baking family, right? That's what they were more famous for before they were. Leon Kossoff was a famous artist. They were the ubiquitous London bakers from the East End, and that's right, he did. And he did a lot of paintings of Willesden Junction. I made a film with Ian Sinclair, the great writer Ian Sinclair, and we went to, and Ian did a piece with Leon Kossoff. He interviewed him and wrote an essay for an exhibition. There was a big exhibition catalogue, and we took that catalogue down to the sidings at Wilston Junction. He used to go down onto the railway sidings and explore them with his son, and he had a studio somewhere in Wilston Junction. And we're not entirely sure where it is, and if anyone knows where it is, I'm sure. Well, actually, I think obviously his family know where it is. I was told the area was Quaker, hence no pubs until recently. It's possible. I mean, obviously All Souls wouldn't have been Quakers, and I imagine they would have been relatively hostile to Quakers. But yeah, Quakers, the Quaker influence generally is not very well known, and yet it's huge, particularly in London, and many of the most I was going to say not necessarily powerful, but still significant families in London were Quaker families. That the Gurney Buxtons, who built London Hospital, that ran London County Council. If they didn't establish London County Council, Elizabeth Fry, the abolitionists, Buxtons were abolitionists. They were all Quakers. In fact, they were all intermarried as well. The Gurneys were an incredibly powerful banking family. They were the banker's banker in the 17th and 18th and 19th century. They formed Barclays Bank. Barclays Bank is a Quaker bank. Lloyd's Bank is a Quaker bank, I think. I think a lot of our high street banks are Quaker banks. The Buxtons, though, here's an interesting, if you want to say no pubs because they were Quakers, the Buxtons, you've drunk their beer. Truman, Hanley and Buxton was a Quaker family brewing business, very important in East London. So I don't know how they squared that with their temperance. That's why they built the London Hospital, because they felt guilty about ruining everyone's health, I think. I was speaking to a former Kensal Rise native a few weeks ago. It's now seen as Queen's Park in Kate. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We also following the London Loop. It's great. I haven't been there since February, but the London Loop, I urge you all to explore it. It shows what a green city London is. It's a brilliant thing. A little bit out from Kensal Rise, but well worth it. I don't think else. Yeah, Claw Bathurst was an implement for passing porter dinners. That's right. It's amazing, isn't it? Margaret describes it, because did Margaret see it, Stephanie? I think she was shown the claw. I think she was passed.
Margaret, you'll have to say for yourself. Margaret, you can unmute yourself. Oh, she's keeping stum about it.
So you can hear that. That is on the playlist, by the way, so you can hear that. Queen's Park Estate, no pubs. Yeah, my personal feeling is that's more likely to be temperance movement to increase the value of property. You see it a lot all around London. Leon Costa did some amazing Wilton Junction. That's right. Streets are alphabetical order. That's right. And actually, unfortunately for the project, this was slightly outside of the it's actually out of the borough. But one of the corners of Kensal, if you're a resident, I mean, you don't really care if you're crossing the border. Some of the streets in, I think, what's called Kensal Town were done initially. They were just given letters initially when they were built and laid out, and then they still followed. So they just added. They named them following on. So A was given, they came up with a name for A, B, C, D. But initially they were just Street A, Street B, Street, etc. That came from Irina and Richard, I think. Our Station Road was where the studio was. Okay, thank you. Do you think the railway's 3 lines of notable physical barriers have had any obvious effect on how locals define their rights to their neighbourhoods? It tends to, doesn't it? I mean, that thing about the wrong side of the tracks. There's a really beautiful story. There's a novel called The Tropic of Ruislip by Leslie Thomas, who's more famous for Stand-Up Virgin Soldiers. But he wrote this novel, which I think was adapted for television in the 70s. And it writes, I think it's about sort of not Pinner, slightly further, sort of Rickmansworth, really, that zone. And he describes brilliantly the way that the railway lines divided that area, and all the new houses were built on one side and the working class houses were on the other. I think often they do, don't they? It seems a bit obvious, but railways definitely do divide up areas to some degree. No booze is usually Methodist. Yeah, quite agree. No alcohol clauses in initial development leases are documented. They were for 100 years and expired recently. Interesting. Do you know the meaning behind Kensal? I do. Kings, thank God someone put it in next. I can't remember. That's a really obvious thing I should have put in the presentation, isn't it? King's Holt, Kingswood. That's right. I'll have a print of Claude Bathurst and his implement. I have a print. Oh, right. Amazing. Donaldson Road was built by the Church Commission in the 1900s, i.e. Church of England. Well, thank you for those wonderful comments. I always learn more after doing these things than before.
Thank you, John. It's been really great. It's been so interesting. And yes, and thanks to everybody for their contributions. And we look forward to working with you maybe a little further on the project.
There's more to do.
Yes, there is. Thank you so much. It's been great. Thanks.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, everybody, for both listening and your wonderful contributions as well. And thank you again. I want to thank again everybody that's made this possible. And I mean, Henry, I don't know if Henry's still here. It wouldn't have happened without Henry. Made it all possible. And yeah, like I say, it's been a real joy and an honour to work with the library. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. And more thanks for coming in. I want to end the meeting so that we can all go and maybe have something to eat if we haven't done already. But all the wonderful thanks are still coming in. That's lovely. Wonderful. Somebody who's now in Kent but was brought up on the Queen's Park Estate and Herbert Gardens. Oh, Fred, how lovely. Great. Thank you. Great. And it is recorded, and somebody asked, where can I get the recording? So we'll look into that. We'll hopefully post it on the website and on Facebook, and we'll definitely look into that. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.